Okay, so let's take our Bibles and go to Genesis chapter 1. And tonight I want to wrap up what's been the last few times we've been together. We've been looking at man. In this series so far, we've looked at God and what are God's characteristics. God is the first being that's mentioned in the Bible. Then we've been looking at man. What is man? And who was he? And what was God's viewpoint of man? What did God make man to be in the beginning? We looked at how God breathed into man, and man became a living soul. That close, intimate relationship that God intended to have with man. And we looked quite extensively at how God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. And we really see the fullness of that in Jesus Christ, because there are only two people in the Bible that are said to be made in the image of God. One was Adam, and the other one is Jesus Christ. And it's through Jesus that we can see what does it mean to be in the image of God. And then how that relates to us, the image of God in us, as we take the Spirit of God, that is the token that God has endowed us with, and make that part of our conscious thinking and mind and heart. We are gradually putting on the image of God until the resurrection, when we, just like Jesus Christ, will be in the image of God, as Romans tells us. And really the final part in looking at God's vision for man is rulership. I think the King James refers to it as dominion. So we're in Genesis chapter 1 and in verse 26. And we'll just read these three verses. We've read them before, but we'll kind of get the impact. In verse 26, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and every crawling thing that crawls on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. God endowed man with dominion and rulership over all of the life that God created on the earth. He says this twice. First time in verse 26 and again in verse 28. We all know when God says something twice, that means it's being established. What an incredibly privileged position God put upon man right from the outset. He made him to be the ruler. So looking at this whole picture of what God did when it came to making man, God, as we've said before, God did something very special. He made man to be a representative of himself. He was to be in the image of God. He was to portray God's characteristics of righteousness, of love, of justice. And that man was to have rulership over all of the things that God had made. That is both that whole thing is rather incredible. God made all this, and then he said to Adam, okay, I'm going to make you to rule over this. The title of Viceroy fits this description very well. The Webster's Dictionary definition of viceroy says, the governor of a country or province who rules as the representative of a king or sovereign. Let's go to Psalms 47, verse 7. I'm just going to read that definition again. The governor of a country or province who rules as the representative of a king or sovereign. The example that comes to mind is of some time ago, but when Great Britain ruled the country of India, Britain installed a viceroy. There were men over the time period that were the viceroy of India. They ruled India on behalf of Queen Victoria. In Psalm 47, it says, for God is the king of all the earth. We should never forget that. God always has been and always will be the king of all of the earth. He is the supreme authority. That is never taken away from God. But as the king, he appointed Adam, man, to be his viceroy, his representative, his ruler, who would rule on his behalf. God is the king, and as king, he appointed man as his viceroy, allowing him to rule on earth as his representative. Man was put in the position of authority as God's viceroy over this vast and wondrous earth that God has made. In Genesis chapter 2, we see God brings all the animals that he had created to Adam so that Adam could name him. This is an example of man's rulership in action. And it's also, I think, an incredible demonstration of God's love. God is the one who created all these living beings, and yet he's given Adam the title. He respects that title and gives him the job at hand. Adam, as the viceroy, was given the task to name all of the animals. This also makes the animals know they are subject to Adam. In the life of Jesus Christ, we see what it means for a man to be made in the image of God and have the authority to rule over all that God has made. In Jesus Christ, we see the power to command the wind to calm the storms. He walked on water. He commanded a fig tree to stop bearing fruit, and it dried up from the roots up overnight. And when God gave man that authority, really those examples in the life of Jesus Christ show us just how far that authority stretched, that he could command the storms and it calmed, that he could walk on the water, that he could command a tree, no fruit, nobody's going to eat fruit hereafter, and it dries up. We don't see that too much in the Bible. Maybe you could think of Elijah, and he prayed and it didn't rain for 3 years and 6 months. But man, in some respects, because man broke that first commandment and sinned, and that sin is now a part of us, and we all die as a result of sin, as Romans 5 goes through. In some respects, the ability to rule over the earth as God intended, that was compromised. It was broken when man broke the first part, which was he was to be made in the image of God. The true leadership, the true rulership over the earth was to be through a man in the image of God, just as we did see and have seen in the life of Jesus Christ. But when man sinned, Really, he forfeited the right to rule because he was no longer truly God's representative. He was no longer truly in God's image. Let's go over to Psalm number 8. And in Psalm 8 and in verse 3, I'm reading from the NASB in this version, these verses. In verse 3 it says, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you think of him, and a son of man that you are concerned about him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You have him rule over the work of your hands. You have put everything under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the animals of the field, and the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea." What a remarkable statement the psalmist makes. Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. Well, as we've just said, we know in the beginning God made man to be his representative, but we also learn an added piece here that he crowned him with glory and majesty. That statement is fitting for a man as God's viceroy, to be crowned with glory and majesty as God's viceroy to rule over the earth. Now, depending on what translation you look at in verse 5, it is either translated God, angels, or heavenly being. And quite honestly, there's a lot of debate. You can read lots of different things, and some people have got a strong case for it being God. Other people have got a strong case for it being angels. The Hebrew word is Elohim, which I'm just going to quote Genesis 1:1. "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That word God is Elohim. But Elohim can be translated based on the context. It certainly is used regarding God Yahweh, but in other contexts it can be used to reference other beings. In the context of this psalm, Psalm 8, the writer is obviously looking back to Genesis 1, talking about when man was in God's image. And he had rulership over the things that God had made. So part of my mind thinks that this is logical, that in this context, Psalm 8 does refer indeed back to God, a little lower than God, as opposed to angels or heavenly beings, because when it came to the task of ruling the world, man was second only to God. Hebrews tells us, when this verse is quoted in Hebrews 2, and in that section of Hebrews, the scriptures tell us that God has not subjected the world to come to angels, that when the kingdom of God comes, it's not going to be subject to angels, it's subject to man, specifically in that context of Jesus Christ. So God did not put the world to come to be subject to angels, and God did not put the world in Genesis 1 under the rule of angels. So there's a very logical case to me that says when it says little lower than God, in the context of this psalm, it is a little lower than God, Elohim, God, Yahweh. I can say that with great confidence, but then there's other information that people could give that would say it's just with the same degree of confidence that it could be angels. So for this point, I'm going to say the jury is out, and I hope to be able to revisit this at the appropriate time. But please feel free to do your research, and if you see it leaning one way more than the other, please let me know. But I think in the context of Psalm 8, it makes sense that it is a little lower than God. But once again, the point is, the emphasis really is about what a position God made man to be. I think man inside, in his heart of hearts, he knows, he looks around the world, he knows he has that ability to have dominion. We might not have the strength of certain animals, but we have the intellect to be able to manage animals. As man has developed with science and engineering, the incredible things that man has done. And we're going to look at an example where the word Elohim is used and it's referring to men. So let's go to Psalm number 82. And this psalm is quoted by Jesus Christ in the Gospels, when they're accusing him of basically claiming that he's the Son of God. And Jesus Christ puts this back on them, saying the scriptures themselves say that you men are gods. So in Psalm 82 verse 6, it says, you are gods, Elohim, sons of the Most High, all of you. Man's position was and still is such that this psalmist, Asaph, wrote of man as a god. They were called gods in the sense that they had power over other men's lives. And in this psalm, God shows how unjustly man has that rulership, has that power, because he is no longer a true representative of God's value system. It talks about, justice and bribery and the children and the widows. God is so concerned about those things, and men were not taking things like that to heart and ruling in that manner. So they're called gods in the sense that they had power over other men's lives. And they could not rule justly because, as we've talked, the sin nature within man overcame and broke their ability to live in the image of God. I'm going to read to you a couple of quotes. The judges and magistrates are compared in this psalm to God because they exercise something of his power in the right of ordering of human society. Another quote says, these human judges stood in the place of the gods above other people. They had the opportunity and the authority to change people's lives with a word, or sometimes even to end a life. That's the power that judges have. And here they are called Elohim. So we do have to be careful that we scrutinize the context to see how this word should be translated. But in an overall sense, when we think about what was God's vision for man, it is extraordinary that God made man something wonderful, something good. He made him in his own image to be his representative, to show God's love, to show God's wisdom, to show God's judgment, his justice, his compassion. And he also made man to have a position of rulership, of dominion. And Jesus Christ, once again, is a wonderful example because he walked as the Son of God with the power and the authority of God, but always remained humble, that God was his Father, that he could only do what God gave him the authority to do and told him to do and gave him permission to do. The phrase that in Psalm 8, he made him a little lower than God. It's however big or powerful a man becomes, to keep that phrase in mind will always keep a man in his correct position, that he is little lower than God, because pride can overcome. Pride comes before a fall. And the way that psalm is written it's perfect, because it keeps a man, even though he's got this rulership, it keeps a man humble and in his proper position, that we are always a little lower than God. The fact that you can say a little lower is quite something, but it's always lower. And that should stop us from falling into the trap of pride. Because you could look at yourself as being an overseer or having authority over others and over the world. And that can fill a man with pride. But keeping that perspective that God has made us lower than him is always the wise thing to do. Because without God, we can't do anything. So it kind of wraps up this section on what was man in the beginning. As I said at the beginning, we've looked at God, what was God, who is God, what are his characteristics, what is his nature. We've looked at man, all the things that God has said about man in the beginning. And the next one to look at is the adversary. So that's where we'll be moving next. So thank you.